Welcome everyone to the December 2019 Tanho Monday Textual Study. I am your host, Shirley Paulson of Early Christian Texts, and our presenter this evening is Dr. Hal Taussig. In this study, we'll be talking about the first revelation of James. This is a story and teaching between Jesus and James, which focuses on what to do with the violent attacks on people by the Roman Empire. They also talk at some length about the reputation that the Jesus movement welcomes women, even as leaders. Just a gentle reminder that donations supporting the creation of these textual study archives are greatly appreciated. $5 to $10 per person per session would be enough to keep us going. You can find the donation link and the text that we're studying tonight, and more information about past and future study sessions, as well as other archived recordings on the Early Christian Texts website by clicking on the button on the home page that says Tanho Monday Textual Studies. So that's it. Hal, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Shirley, and I'm glad to be with all of you at the end of this year. It's been really a nice year of Monday studies. And so tonight, as usual, I'm mostly interested in being in conversation with you all. It's my understanding that probably many of you have read the text for this evening, and some of you have not, and some of you may have given up on reading the text. This is a text that is part of what we call the Nag Hammadi Library, which is a discovery of 52 different texts from the earliest Christ movements of the first, second, and third century. And it was all found in a jar. And we're still working very hard on getting some of the basics in these 52 documents in hand and thinking with these documents that are, for the most part, almost entirely new. And we are, but it's both churches and scholars were not particularly welcoming of the discovery of so many new texts. And so finally, in the last generation or so, there have been more scholars that have been working on this. But if you find yourself transfixed by some of these texts as we work on them, it is true that there's lots of work to be done. So anybody who wants to learn Coptic or something, jump right in. And you don't have to learn Coptic in order to really do good work with these texts. I think I'll say just a little bit about the first revelation of James, and then we'll open up for some thoughts of yours. In two regards, I can say a few things. So this is, there are, in the Nag Hammadi Library, there are two revelations of James, the first and the second. Both of them have very much in common. Jesus talking with James, and both have them very much in common with one another, a sense of fear about being killed. In both of these revelations of James, they have a sense that the Roman Empire is threatening their very life. It's a little bit more powerfully clear, and there's some gruesome scenes in the second revelation of James, which we might want to take up in the next several months sometime as well. This you can see mostly simply a real anxiety and fear by James that he will be killed. Both he and Jesus are, to a certain extent, worried about the fact that there are people in Jerusalem who are kind of in charge of Jerusalem that are very dangerous. Now, the key thing here is the word that is basically not translated in your text. You may have seen the word archon in the text, and that's simply a Greco-Coptic word. In the manuscripts themselves. And this is one of the big problems we've had with translation. In many cases, the scholars that have spent in some cases 40 or 50 years on just translating these texts, in many cases, the people who did the first and second generations of the translations of many of these newly discovered texts were taught by their teachers that these texts were weird and meant to be confusing. And so actually the translators in many ways infused the text with confusion that wasn't there. So for instance, that this text uses the word archon is really bizarre, because the word archon in both Coptic and Greek has a really completely clear meaning, and that's leader or ruler. But you will see in this text that probably most of you have read that it's not called the rulers, it's called the archons. Archon is a very important name because, of course, the archons that are in this text are headquartered to a certain extent in Jerusalem. And we're almost sure that that's just a reference to the fact that, of course, Rome is controlling and has captured Jerusalem. So the archons are almost certainly the rulers of Rome that have now set up camp or set up their residences in Jerusalem, as in many other places which Rome conquered. So it's the fact that the archons, the rulers, are in Jerusalem and Jesus are there makes it really dangerous for them. So I've told some of you in other studies that Josephus, the Jewish historian of the first century, says that Pilate, only in his 10 years where he was ruling Jerusalem for the Romans, he crucified 10,000 people. So no wonder in this text are Jesus and James worried about getting crucified. Or in this case, they don't say crucified, they just say, yeah, they're going to get us. So one of the key things I'm really interested in this text is what it did to early Christ people and early Christ groups to be in the middle of a military occupation. Basically, no matter where they lived, they were being occupied militarily. And that we know from other Roman documents that the Roman documents encouraged their soldiers to crucify, kill, capture, and torture. So that's one of the things I'm hoping us to talk about is we have both inside the New Testament and outside a real consciousness of violence and danger. Another thing that I thought might be helpful for us to just think a little bit about our numbers. You may have noticed that this text is interested in numbers. For instance, it's James is mixed up in his conversation with Jesus about whether there are 7 or 12 people who are important. And this, of course, I would say is partly references to how many different groups, including groups of disciples, there were, and how many there were. I would just say that from my point of view, the debate about 7 or 12 is a debate throughout the Mediterranean basin itself, because more or less everybody knows that the two big numbers are 12 and 7 in the world, because they are numbers of completeness. And for different reasons, they're numbers of completeness. And so this is a larger debate than a debate for the early Christ people. But in the early Christ people, this takes on the debate of how many really important people are there in our movement. One other really main thing that I'd like us to talk a little bit about before or at the beginning is the two creations in the book of Genesis. You may not know that this is important to this text, but it really is a big deal. And you may not know that there are two stories of the creation in the book of Genesis. It's quite clear if you read chapters 1 and chapters 2, the creation of the world in 7 days happens in chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 4. And then that's it. But then there's another creation that happens that involves Adam and Eve, and another creation of the world. It turns out that because more or less most of the Christ people of the first 2 centuries were within the frame of reference of Israel, a lot of them knew that Genesis was really important. And a lot of them were really confused about why Genesis would have 2 creation stories, one right after the other. Of course, I would say we all should be confused about that. It's kind of a goofy thing that Genesis starts with one creation, and then it kind of goes back to the beginning and has, for instance, in chapter 1, people are already created. But then in chapter 2, Adam and Eve are created as if this is new. So in other words, we, like the ancients, should be kind of saying, what in the world is going on? But one of the things that we need to know, our text for this evening, is that so people started thinking why they wrote 2 texts. And so this text of the first revelation of James refers to their trying to figure out why there are 2 creation stories at the beginning of Genesis. And we'll come back to that a little bit more, but I'll just say one thing you may remember, and it means to be a little corrective. In this text of the first revelation of James, very early on, both Jesus and James say, oh yeah, we know women were created second. And that has to do, of course, with the second um, creation story in chapter 2, where it's Adam and Eve. In chapter 1, men and women are created together. And so basically in the first revelation of James, this is a very nuanced and interesting address to how important women are in the early Christ people. You'll see later in this story, after that first reference to women being second, that the text comes around, and at first one might say, oh, this is yet another biblical put down of women. And that might be going on too. But basically, the story, one of the ways that the ancient Christ people and other ancient people that read the Bible, one of the things they had decided is that the figure of Wisdom Sophia in the Bible, who also creates the world with God in the book of Proverbs, she was the one who did it the second time. And she did it without the help of God the Father. So, in other words, then it turns out that James is really interested in Jesus explaining, telling him about the 7 most important women in the world. And these happen to be then 7 leaders who are all women in the early church. You'll notice that's also interesting because it looks like there might be 12 men and 7 women. I should stop soon so you can get in on the action. I want to just say a couple of things about some weird words. There's a word that is Galgalon. We think that is Golgotha. There's a word that is Adalon. We think that is the early Christ movement leader Thaddeus. Oh. It'll take me about 20 minutes to explain why we think that, and we can get back to it, but I just want to, again, one of the things that makes us studying these newly discovered texts is we feel kind of we don't know what's going on. So I thought I would get you a little bit of info on some of these key elements and some of the words that don't make some sense. So I'd like to then open up our conversation. You can jump in on things I've said, or you can jump in on things that you've read. The most important thing for me is that we have conversation together, and I want to reassure you that in this 1 hour, we will not figure it all out.
Hal, which one did you say is Thaddeus?
Thaddeus is Adalon.
Adalon?
Yes. So, sometimes in Coptic, spelled also Adelaide.
Okay. I'm just trying to find it. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
I have a question about the reference to James being the brother, but not materially. Is it thought that this really is Jesus' brother with the same mother? I would think because if they have the same mother, they wouldn't say not material or materially, or was he a brother in Christ, so to speak?
Oh, such a great question. Mainly because that kind of question really gets us to another dynamic in this text. So some of us may be aware that the word James is also really mixes us up in the study of the first and second century, because it looks like there are 2, 3, or 4 Jameses. And yes, one of them is the brother of Jesus, or as the text says in another case, the mother of, or the son of the mother. But probably there are actually more than 2 Jameses. There's also James the Just, who's also referred to in this text. So I think that, yes, you're right. This is wanting to discourage that this James is the brother of Jesus.
Okay.
But the other thing is that I think it's also wanting to discourage that this is James the Just. So it's ambiguous about him being called James the Just. It could be that this is wanting to say this is not Jesus' brother, it's James the Just. Now, how we got the word, the name James the Just is not quite clear, but of course justice is a real big thing in that time, because there's so much state produced violence. So to be just in the middle of such a terrible government would be a big deal.
Thanks.
Am I getting a little bit of clarity, Hillary?
Yeah, that helps. It's sort of what I thought, but from my study too, I thought that James, who becomes the head of the church later, who supposedly was Jesus' brother, was not a follower during Jesus' lifetime. So then you wonder, what is this dialogue going on between them? So I was just sort of curious what your take was on it.
Yeah, and there's also a reference to a James who is the father of one of the disciples as well. So yeah, it's and it's clear in other texts that James the brother is actually very important for some of the groups.
I just had a quick question.
Please.
So in the book of Acts, chapter 12, there's a sentence that says that Herod put James, the brother of John, to death with the sword. Is this the same James? And regardless, can you help us understand the timeline that exists from when this particular revelation of James was written and when this incident occurred that's discussed in Acts chapter 12?
Oh, thank you so much. Maybe I can get some traction here. So yeah, that reference I would say is the James and John. But the question is, does James and John in a number of the New Testament texts, does that match up with James the Just? And I cannot give you much help on that. But I would tend to say that James is not the James of that is the brother of Jesus. And then we can go. Did that help?
Yeah, and then in terms of a timeline, do we know when the revelation of James was written approximately?
No, so this is, I mean, and to tell you the truth, there's a really big discussion in scholarship right now when the Acts of the Apostles was written too. So, I mean, right now, a lot of scholars are putting the Acts of the Apostles into the 2nd century. So there's a big, we scholars simply mostly show how much we don't know in a lot of these things. But I would say in terms of when this this revelation of James was written, it's probably really too early to know. But here, let me say a couple more things to show how confused and interested I am in it. When you look at the vocabulary in this, it seems quite early in that it, so for instance, if it were in the late 2nd or early 3rd centuries, you might find references to a bunch of other things and people that going on. It seems relatively early and not cluttered with what one might call later belief controversies. And, a lot of texts you might find that are more interested in fairly complicated belief system questions. So that makes me want to think that that this is relatively early. I would say in the first century and a half. On the other hand, the evidence of Wisdom Sophia being the second creator in the second creation story in this. In other words, this is yet another group because they really love Hebrew Bible. They want to figure out what's going on in Genesis, and so they're really working hard on this. And one of the main things that begins to happen is that because Wisdom Sophia in Proverbs creates. They try to insert her into the question about how you have the two creation stories in Genesis. And she intervenes to in a number of these trying to figure it out stories. She intervenes to create people without God the Father's help. We have more evidence of that in the 2nd century than the 1st century. One other thing I would ask, just to work on, so when is this? Then this really strong attention to the fact that there are women leaders in this. You might want to say, so when do we know about that? And the problem there is we know that is strong in both the 1st and the 2nd century. So I would want to say this tends to be my guess, which, and again, here I have to go back to what I've said on other Monday nights, is whenever a scholar says they know, just whenever I say I know this, I'm probably lying. So it's just too hard. But I would tend to say late 1st, early 2nd century. But I'm not sure.
Carl, I have a question kind of along those lines about this structure and so forth. Could you comment on the 3 detainers on page 34?
Oh, let me see if I've got the same text. I do not have that same text that has a page 34 on it. Could you tell me?
Well, sure. I'll read the bottom page 34 of the Codex, and this is this version here. It's on page 328 of this edition, but not in the middle. If you fall into the hands of the 3 detainers who carry off souls by theft to that place, in order to ellipsis them, you are to say to them, I am a vessel that is more precious than the female who.
Yes, got it. And are you using the James Robinson text?
Translated by Wolf Peter Funk.
It's the
Oh, nice. Yes.
it's the Meyer.
Yes.
That's the Meyer one?
Yeah. Yes.
And so your question about that
Meyer
was
one, yeah.
in terms of the three detainers.
Oh, just if you can comment on them.
No, I can't. I have no clue.
Not at all?
Nope.
Oh,
I think the things that I have seen suggested on that, none of them make much sense. And I would want to say, I think these three detainers are real people in the lives of the authors of this book. In other words, I think, and what you may notice around the edges is this text is a text in which people aren't sure who's in charge, and that some people who you think are going to be bad, this text is really quick to say, I know they look bad, they're kind of bad, but I think things are going to work out with them. And for the three detainers here, it feels to me as if these are three important, probably powerful leaders, either around but outside the Christ movements, or even inside them. Because I guess I would want to say one more thing about me thinking that way to get some traction on this question. This text seems to be so alive with who's in charge, who's going to get hurt, and its overall answer seems to be that, in some contrast to other texts of the 1st and 2nd century, this text seems to be saying enmity that we feel is not as real as you think it is. So here, this is the same case with the three detainers, or however we would take that. That here you have, for instance, in the same paragraph, the reference to Sophia, Achamoth, and so she has created without having relationships with God the Father, and that seems bad, but it's going to work out. So, sorry, that's as close as I can get, and that's more to the tone than to the identification. I apologize for not knowing.
no, that's fine. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm not afraid of silence until some of your thoughts come forward, but I have other things to say. But let's just wait a little bit to see if some of you. It's a fascinating text, and I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts or questions.
All right. Well, then I can't help asking Hal if you're going to wait. Are you going to be drawing a link between the fear and the fear of being killed with the two stories in Genesis? I mean, like, why are they together in this text?
Well, and again, Shirley, you have written on some of this, so I'm hoping you can jump in as well. I think that the reason that a whole bunch of the early Christ peoples are really interested in Genesis is that it's at the beginning.
Okay.
And that the big question for almost everybody under Rome is, are we going to survive? And so this is by far not the only, you can find this, for instance, in 1 Corinthians as well. This is by far not the only place where you have the feeling that, we are really in trouble. And a bunch of us are, as for instance, the letter of Peter to Philip, which is also in the Nag Hammadi. They say, it feels like they're going to get us all. Or in the Gospel of Mary, where the disciples say to Mary, if they killed him, why won't they kill us? Or in the disciples in the 4 canonical Gospels, where they're petrified that they won't survive either. So I think that what a lot of the writers are trying to do is say, let's go back to the beginning and see if that has some help for us, and how Jesus relates to what was in the beginning.
Oh, I can't wait to get more about this.
But you've written on this, so
yeah.
Can you reflect on your own question?
Well, I haven't studied it in this text, but I will say that I know that I think it's Foucault in particular who commented on the fact that in ancient times there was a perceived way of solving problems by going back to the beginning. In other words, instead of living out a problem by solving it and then going on, a solution to a problem was always going back to the beginning and rethinking its beginning again and again. So the beginning was a significant way of solving problems in antiquity.
Oh, and thank you. Yes, that is true, and I think it's especially true in the late Greek dimensions that are coming into these centuries. Later Platonism really also starts turning back towards the beginning as a way of thinking about how do we get out of this mess.
What do you mean by the beginning? Maybe Genesis 1 or what?
Well, in this case, I was just bouncing off of Shirley's question about that. That's what I meant there. I don't want to. I don't want to suggest that all of that everybody in the Mediterranean world thought that were thinking about the same beginning. In other words, the weird thing about Genesis is that it's a part of is very respected by the Greco-Roman world.
Oh, really?
But it's not. But of course, it's a really different story of the beginning than many of the stories of the Greco-Roman.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, I'm one of the things that I find myself doing most as I study both canonical and extra-canonical literature is to read it socially. And for me, this text, I just hope that we have in the next 10 years 5 people who take on the issue of women's leadership in this text. It feels to me like it is really juicy. And that it is a new territory from so much of the other texts that we've been mining for so long because we don't have other texts. I mean, that applies, of course, now to, we should be working a lot more on the Gospel of Mary and the Thunder Perfect Mind and things like that. But this text is not doing the same thing as either the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John or the Thunder Perfect Mind. This is another picture of women's leadership, and women's leadership as somewhat powerful and as somewhat in danger. So since this is such a juicy piece that we haven't heard before about women's leadership, are there questions you yourself are asking about women and men's leadership in the early Christian communities?
We don't hear much about women's leadership.
Too bad, because you know it's in basically every letter of Paul. If you count Paul having 7 letters, he's always saying hi to the women leaders at the beginning or the end. So yeah. It's true that we don't usually read those, especially all of the greetings to the women leaders that Paul does. We don't really get to look at because they're often at the last part of the book, and because people are kind of afraid to think about women's leadership. Yeah, that's a good point. So I want to say it's both in the New Testament and in all of these other texts in ways that are, in other words, it's weird from my point of view that one will always quote 1 Timothy, which is anti-woman, or the post-Pauline letters which say women obey your husband and things like that. So those are in the minority, but they're the ones that get quoted.
I want to say I wasn't prepared, but what I did read, it made me think of on the origins of the world, some of the wording, and when you look at on the origins of the world, the role of women is prominent, and the Sophia story is in that book, and so I'm wondering, is there a connection to the origins of the world and this revelation with the discussion of Sophia and women leadership?
Stephanie, yeah, go ahead.
Well, because of the role of women, Eve is important. She speaks life into Adam, and he comes forth. Sophia, the whole words that they use in what is the word you said, the archons, and you see those words in the origin of the world, and so it's a connection between those two books and the role of women with these two books and the writers of these books.
Yeah, Stephanie, this is amazing that what's happened just in the last 10 or 15 minutes. I'm complaining that people haven't done enough work, but the last 2 voices to speak are Shirley's and yours, and both of you have so much that you've worked on this matter. So first of all, thank you for all that you're doing, both of you. And then secondly, yes, Stephanie, this is very clearly in other words, what's going on in First Revelation of James and on the origins of the world is the conversation that is in both of their situations. So yes, the role of Sophia here is very much like the role of Sophia on the origins, and I would say in the Gospel of John, where Sophia ends up being at the beginning in really clear ways as well. Now, at the same time, then Stephanie, what I would say is that then there's something new here too, because I don't know any other place, and I hope someone else does, where the author's saying, now tell me again who the 7 really famous women are. Right? This is just amazing that there is clearly this has been a conversation in the voice of James with other people already, and he's sort of like saying, "Oh yeah, I forgot. Now who are they again?"
So it kind of makes you think of the Gospel of Mary when Thomas has to tell Peter, Peter, you can't question what she's saying because obviously she is, she knows what we don't know. And then there's, I think it is, I could be wrong, the Gospel of Thomas talking about women have to become like men, alluding to leadership. So obviously, there's female leadership. You just got to really pull it out the text. But you're right, this is new, where specifically it's saying, we know that there are women leaders. Let's name them one more time. You know what I mean?
I do, yes, and yes, you're exactly right. So now, when we can get outside of sort of looking at the post-Pauline literature as the only authority on men and women, we can find all kinds of major emphasis that there's big time women's leadership in the early Christ communities, and there's big controversies about it. And what I'm saying, in addition to that, is that here there's all kinds of evidence of women's leadership in this growing set of texts, but what they have in common is that there are women leaders, and there are women leaders who are being attacked. But none of them are lining up as if there's only one discussion. There's a lot of really great different ways of thinking about what the women leadership are and aren't doing. And forgive me for being too excited about this text, but I've never, when I bumped into this like 7 years ago about the 7 leaders, I thought, whoa, that's even another.
When we read the Odes, it's clear because the Odes is liturgy, that there's a female presence, there's women present, and even in the Odes, you can see the wrestling and how the pronouns and the relationship between female, male, and even the gender roles with God having breath, and being milk. And so, I think it is exciting because it's obvious that women had a significant presence in the first century. It's just clear from the beginning. But I think you guys want to see it and get past the patriarchy that's been, handed down to us so long.
Absolutely. And so, for instance, in the Odes of Solomon, which are, again, so new to so many people, and you're really working hard on them. So the Odes of Solomon, in terms of gender, the biggest thing is the right hand of God is a big character in the Odes of Solomon. The right hand of God is really a person, and it's a female person.
Right.
Natalie, you want to say something about the Odes of Solomon now that we're talking about that and women?
I mean, I don't think I have anything to add. Stephanie said
Okay.
all of the things. It sounds great. I agree. I co-sign all of that.
Yeah. Well,
It's sad that we have to work so hard to bring it out. I'll say that. Something
And
that
it's-
is so obvious.
and it's so great that we're finding more stuff.
Right.
So I noticed that we've got 4 minutes left. So those of you who haven't answered the 3 most important questions or thoughts that you have, let's go for it.
I had a question about the passwords that are mentioned in different commentaries about this. Is that at the end when Jesus is telling James what to say when he's asked questions? Are those considered the passwords?
Yeah, that's what they're called. That is a scholarly framework. Yeah, and you'll find that also, for instance, in the letter of Peter to Philip in Nag Hammadi. There they say there are 2 words, and then they don't tell us what they are.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And I didn't understand why portions of the text are indented. I didn't get what that meant.
Oh, yeah. Just to set that clearly, I don't know either. When you look at the manuscript itself, is basically all there are breaks in the text from one, but mostly the texts are all in a line in the Coptic, with no difference even between the letters in one word to another. So this, I know that in different English versions of this is not necessarily broken up this way. Often you'll find a translator wanting to put all the words that fit here in terms of meaning in one paragraph. But rarely do you have a paragraph kind of indentation in the text itself. It feels to me like I'm right now looking at the Shadle translation, and there the thing I like about it is he really makes sure that when there's a word missing, he doesn't fill it in. And the thing I don't like about it is I don't think that this is actually the indentation that is in the Coptic itself. I will double check on that. I don't have the Coptic right in front of me, but I will double check on that to make sure I'm guessing a little bit on that.
I would like to just speak to that point, Hal, about your responding to things. You should all know that you can have a continued conversation about these things on the Facebook Early Christian Text Conversation page. So, for example, last month, Hillary continued to ask a bunch of questions and Hal answered them. And you're also able to continue asking questions there, and we'll get Hal to answer questions there too. So please note that that's on the Early Christian Text Conversations Facebook page.
It looks like someone wrote a question in the chat box.
Do you see where the chat box is, Hal?
Okay, and could you tell me what it is, because I am right now on the text page?
It says the right hand of God is a person, a female person. You said?
Well, Natalie,
Yes.
back up before that. At 7:25, Daniel wrote, was there a text you published and shared on this talk earlier on? Would be glad to get a copy and read to. And then Mark added a comment here for everyone to see. He gave us a link to answer that question. And then Middle Church also gives us another link. And then Daniel said, okay, that's you. Okay, then after that, Daniel says, the right hand of God is a person, a female person. You said he's asking. That's the question then.
And yeah, thank you. And the answer is yes to that last question. And no, I have not published on this text. I've been busy with other ones, but I'm so glad. I've studied it a lot, but I'm still working on it. I would love to write a book about it.
And I think we should also ask Mark Madison. Have you written on this, Mark?
No, actually, I have not written on this text. No.
Okay, all right. Okay, well, I know that both of you are writers on these texts, so okay. So,
however,
yeah, go ahead.
However, as a shameless act of self-promotion, I'm happy to include on the comment chat a website for people to look at. Oops, I didn't. Hold on. Did I get the right thing here? Here we are.
And do you want to tell us a word about what your website is?
Oh, just my website where I have public domain translations of early extra-canonical Gospels. Not this one, but other texts.
And Mark, and you have a translation of First Revelation of James?
No, not of this one, no.
Okay.
All right, well, we should probably conclude now. Hal, do you have one more thing to say, or should I wrap it up then?
No, you just wrap it up.
All right, well, on behalf of 23 or 24 of us today, I would like to thank you, Hal, especially for this very fascinating topic and getting us all excited about it. And thank everybody else for your participation. So this was the December 2019 Tanho Monday Textual Studies discussion on the first revelation of James, led by Dr. Hal Taussig. Once a month from 8 to 9 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday nights, generally the 4th of the month, the Tanho Center sponsors a discussion of one of the early Christian texts. Each session is led by a trained scholar who shares a well-framed overview of this particular text, allowing for discussion time for participants. And to remind you that donations supporting the creation of these textual studies archives are greatly appreciated. To donate, simply click on the Tanho Monday Textual Studies button on the Early Christian Texts home page. And you'll also find a donation button directly for the Early Christian Texts so that we can keep up hosting the website. Thanks so much, and we hope to see you next month.